Welcome to week 2 of CET 251, Elements of Surveying 1. I wanted to go through some information, make sure that you guys were doing what you're supposed to be doing for the second week of the course, and review a little bit from week 1. So under the announcements section of the course, you will see that I've got a couple of announcements here. One, we've got some ASE section meetings, and the Constructor for a Day program has been scheduled. So if you are on or near campus, then these are events that you may want to be a part of. There are a couple of you that have not completed the week 1 assignment. You need to make sure that you get that finished. All of the student introductions are finished. Please make sure you go through and you read who all is in this class. We have a wide variety of experiences and educational backgrounds that we're bringing together for this particular course. And if you have comments or experiences that you want to share with the class from things that you've done, then by all means we should do that. As far as the week 2, you'll notice that I posted an announcement so that you would see that that material is there. And that the bookstore on campus does have the books that you need for this course. If you go under course content on the course and you go down to week 2, you'll see that there's reading in the books. You've got chapters 1 and 17 in Evidence and Procedures book, and chapters 14 and 15 in the Boundary Control book. Some of you are using older versions of the book, which is fine. Specifically in the Boundary Control book, Chapter 15 did not exist in previous versions. Ethics or something, I guess, relatively new to surveying. So Chapter 15 is called out as its own chapter in the 7th edition of the book. So I did copy the 15th chapter, and you do have that in the week 2 material. As you're going through the week 2 material, and you're looking at the information that I have posted here, you'll see that there are notes that you should look at and you should read through, because this is essentially your lecture that you have for this particular course. The Chapter 15 PDF, like I said, that is the actual chapter copied out of Brown's Boundary Control book, 7th edition. So those of you that don't have that, that's where you can find it. I've asked you to visit some websites, and as far as these websites, these are the rules that govern land surveyors in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. So you want to make sure you look up and you're familiar with this information, because that is what's going to govern what you do as a professional land surveyor. I've given you some definitions of land surveying. Please look at the attachments and read through that material. And some articles. I did post a brand new article that just came out from POB, and the question is, and what you have to write an essay to for activity 2 is, how do you explain to somebody what land surveying is? A lot of times the problem with surveying is that nobody knows what it is or what it is that we do. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to iterate that information to somebody else that asks. So that is your assignment that's due on Sunday for this week, is to put together that essay. I did want to call your attention to the actual book. So if you want to grab your Brown's Boundary Control book, you have chapters 14 and 15 that you need to look at in this particular book. Chapter 14 is the role of the surveyor. If you look on page 462, it has principles that are discussed in the chapter. There's principles 1 through 19 that show up in this particular chapter. If you read nothing else, read through these principles. If you need additional information on any of them, that's what you're going to find in the chapter. Now, what should happen is, if you want to be a boundary surveyor, you should find this information very interesting and want to read it. But I wanted to call out a few of these. Principle number 1, what a boundary is a question of law. Where a boundary is a question of fact. So what you're doing is, when you're doing a retracement survey, you are retracing the original survey on the ground based on the deed that you have for that particular property. Principle 2, the creating and retracing boundary surveyor should not give legal opinions, either in writing or orally, to clients. You're talking about facts, you're evaluating evidence. You don't want to tell them about law. You're not a lawyer. Surveying is quasi-judicial, which means that, yes, we know about it, but no, we cannot give opinions on it. Principle 3, the creating and retracing surveyor is obligated to keep current on legal opinions rendered by the courts by various jurisdictions. This can affect how you do your survey and what evidence you're going to hold when you are doing those surveys. Principle 4, only an original survey has permanency of location. A retracement survey is subject to collateral attack by any subsequent surveyor. The original survey creates the lines to be described and then retraced. An original survey never changes, so you need to make sure that you're relying on that original survey when you do a retracement. Principle 5, in a retracement, a surveyor surveys deed lines or description lines created by the original survey. So that's what I just said. Principle 6, unless modified by a written contract, a retracing surveyor's responsibility is to retrace and identify those lines that were created by the original surveyor. No surveyor is vested with the authority to make the determination of property rights. That's important. That gets into legal issues as well. Surveyors report on facts and do not advise of property rights. If we skip down to Principle 9, a surveyor should examine sufficient documents either called for directly or implied in the client's conveyance or description. This includes obtaining necessary maps, plats, drawings, deeds, and references to adjacent parcels from private, public, and other sources. When you're doing a retracement survey, you should never look at only your own property. You need to look at all of the adjoiners to make sure there's no gaps or overlaps or other problems that you're going to run into. Principle 10, a surveyor has no authority to determine property ownership or property rights. That's a legal issue, not a surveying issue. The surveyor locates boundaries in accordance with and in relation to legal descriptions. Skipping down to Principle 16, the final product of land survey should be a plat delivered to the client in conformance with the minimum technical standards of the state, as well as a professional opinion as to the identification of the boundaries of the parcel of land. You have to know what the state minimum standards are, and you have to know what an ordinary prudent surveyor would do in your area. So this is particularly important and why I've got all these links to the statutes in the course. Then Principle 19 on page 464, a surveyor will assume the responsibility and liability for using the substandard or inaccurate work of other surveyors. Assumption of the risks will attach to the entire substandard work, not only the portion in error. Whenever you're doing a retracement survey, you need to look at the original survey. If you just go on the previous survey, if that surveyor made a mistake and has any errors on it, you are then making those same mistakes and you're liable for that. So anytime you're doing a survey, you should go back to the original survey to find out what it should be. If they're different, you need to find out why. So that's where you're going to need to do some additional research. In Chapter 15, page 479, that's where you're going to find the principles in this particular chapter. This is Principle 2, if the creating surveyor or retracing surveyor is hesitant about his or her ability to perform the requested services, he or she should decline the project. So not everybody is able to do work in all areas of surveying and geomatics. You want to stick to what you're able to do and what you know. In a retracement, Principle 3, it is better to have an imprecise survey where the land actually exists than it is to have precise measurements where the land does not exist at all. This goes into, and somebody mentioned the pincushion effect, that the original monuments, if they are there from the original survey, those are what hold whether the bearing and distance is correct or not. You have to hold the intent of the original monumentation. So that is a very, very important one. Some people come out and they take their very fancy equipment and they measure that angle to the nearest hundredth of a second, and they measure that distance to the nearest thousandth of a foot. It really doesn't matter. You're not going to set a pen right next to another pen, at least I hope not. You're going to use the original monument because that monument was placed without error, is the assumption legally. Principle 4, the surveyor should strive to help resolve any boundary dispute before it becomes a litigious matter. Principle 6, a creating surveyor should leave sufficient credible evidence, both field and record, that physically and legally describes the property boundary lines that he or she creates for future recovery. There's some companies out there that will do original surveys and they'll not set corners, and they look at that as job security so that they then have to do all of the retracements. That is unethical. Every monument should be set per the statutes for that particular state. So please make sure, if you're working for a company that's not going and setting corners, that they do make sure that they go back and do that. If you look at Principle 12, before attempting any boundary project, the surveyor should have an understanding of the differences between original surveys and retracements. All right, an original survey, that's the one that creates the property. That original survey never changes. A retracement is retracing that original survey. So you don't change what was originally done. You're just finding evidence of it. Principle 13, an original boundary line and corners once created and described can never be recreated or redescribed. They can only be retraced in relation to the original survey. Principles 15 and 16 kind of go hand in hand. The principle of original boundary creation are more technical than legal. The principles of boundary retracement are more legal than technical. So keep that in mind when you're doing a retracement survey. Principle 17, in conducting a retracement, the retracing surveyor should obtain not only the most current description of the lines, but also the original description. I already talked about that a little bit. Principle 18, the retracing surveyor should understand how the priority of calls can aid in the retracement process and should realize that in some states, not applying these principles could lead to a claim of negligence. And then Principle 20, in a boundary retracement, the retracing surveyor should not retrace the common boundary for and between two different clients. So you've got two clients next door to each other. They each call you about doing a survey on their line. If you've gotten paid for doing it for one, you don't also get paid for doing it for the other client. So that's what you've got to read through in Brown's Boundary Control book. In the Evidence and Procedures book, you're going to start with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 gives you information about surveying, just some background and information for this particular book. It talks about, at the bottom of page 1, that boundary surveying is divided into two general areas. One, locating, relocating originally described parcels of land, or creating new parcels, so that's your original or your retracement surveys. In attempting to survey and locate a described parcel of land, the only permanent and correct location of its boundaries is where a court of competence jurisdiction would locate them. You have to keep that in mind. You have to know how the courts are going to look at things. The final location of any boundary is nothing more than an opinion of the evidence recovered, evaluated, and then interpreted, and this is always subject to review by the courts and by other subsequent surveyors. You don't have to agree with other surveyors. You should, but if you're looking at evidence and they're looking at evidence and you're looking at two different ways, there may be some disagreement on what you come up with and how you resolve a boundary. It does talk about NCEES on page 5 in the book, and that was week 1, and hopefully you went through that website and you see the importance of that to your future if you plan on getting licensed, and how that can guide you to doing well on the exams. Then as you go through the chapter and you get to the last page, page 12, the last sentence or last two sentences in this are really important. Courts have always ruled that measurements are the least reliable of all items of evidence. The least reliable of all items of evidence are the measurements, and that they should only be used as a last resort. Measurements contain errors. Original corners, positions by law are without error. That's huge. You guys need to make sure that you understand that. And why that is. Then the other chapter in this book that you're looking at is chapter 17, which is professional stature. You want to read through this chapter, get the information. On page 519, it does go through 15 different principles. Make sure that you read through those. It talks about what a profession is. It says on page 519, the possession of a license does not make one a professional. And you guys will meet people as you go through that make you scratch your head with their professionalism. On page 522, 17-4, attributes of a profession. Read through this. This is what makes you a professional. Okay? Then, as you go through the rest of the chapter, it talks about ethics. On page 524, the only products the professional surveyor sells are time, knowledge, and advice. That's what you're selling. On page 527, at no time should a surveyor discuss the legal ramifications of a case with a client. Again, quasi-judicial for surveying. You are not a lawyer or an attorney. You are looking at evidence, evaluating evidence, and answering questions of fact. Okay, so you can tell them what exists, but you cannot tell them how it relates to their property specifically. So make sure, again, that you read through all this material and that you understand what's here. And then you've got your essay to write, so hopefully you'll do all right with that. I will get graded your week 1 material, and I did notice that it did not self-grade like it was supposed to. So if any of you get a grade lower than you were expecting, go ahead and resubmit that, and I'll regrade it for you. Because again, the idea is that you would understand the material, and so I'll let you keep turning that in. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.